is Conrad McKerron. Conrad is a senior VP for an organization called As You Sow, and that's an Oakland-based nonprofit that promotes corporate social responsibility through shareholder advocacy. He's going to be talking about the challenges, risks, and opportunities involved in the transition to recyclable multi-material packaging. Conrad has engaged a lot of very major brand owners whom you will recognize and know: Coca-Cola, Colgate-Palmolive, Pepsi, Procter & Gamble on sustainable packaging, companies such as Amazon, Apple, Best Buy, and Dell on electronic waste recycling. And in the social arena, he's also engaged with companies like Gap, McDonald's, Nordstrom, Nike, and Walt Disney. His most recent focus challenges consumer brands to make plastic packaging more recyclable and to take more responsibility for improvement of recycling collection and processing systems. Without further ado, Conrad McKerron.
Hello. Thanks for sticking around. I know it's that lull in the afternoon, and I'll try to zip along here and not drag things out. And thank you to all the presenters. Earlier, I think we've had an excellent group, and a lot of them have Hello. Thanks for sticking around. I know it's that lull in the afternoon, and I'll try to zip along here and not drag things out. And thank you to all the presenters. Earlier, I think we've had an excellent group, and a lot of them have expounded on parts of things I was going to do, so I will make it even faster for you, hopefully. As You Sow is an unusual group. We are basically a nonprofit that uses shareholder advocacy to pressure companies to improve their environmental and social practices as shareholders of the company. And so we work with other investors, often called green investors or SRI, socially responsible investors, to directly challenge management to improve performance. And I've basically worked in the waste sector now for over 15 years, and I thought I'd talk a bit about some of the work that we've done. And Doug asked me to look at flexibles. Obviously, there's already been a lot of talk about flexibles, so I'm going to do that, but I'm also going to share some of the bigger pictures. I think we're getting to the point of the day where some of these big challenges that Maura just raised, the policy issues and the investment issues are critical, and I'll try to touch on those. So first, I wanted to say that I started all this work longer than I like to admit. Around the turn of the century, I began to talk to Coke and Pepsi because I was just very irritated about the low recycling rates in this country for bottles and cans. And I was a research analyst at an investment firm, and I just felt like we could do better as a country, with the amount of brain power and resources we have. Why do we have such a ridiculous, 30% recycling rate for bottles and cans? And sadly, that hasn't dramatically improved in all this time. We've made some progress. A lot of findings, but we still struggle. And if I could put it all into one thought, I think the thing that sticks out is that because of our unique American politics and culture, we're not in a situation where there are mandates. And let's face it, I don't think voluntary actions have been enough. And we're going to talk about that, but if I could distill one message here today, it's that we're going to have to find a way, if we can't do mandates, to get some kind of shared responsibility between the brands and municipalities. So, oops, what do I push? There we go. Let's talk a bit about the flexible packaging, because clearly that's predominant today. Next to corrugated, flexibles are now the second highest, most highly used packaging material. I mean, they're just tearing up the market. And the 23% there is probably because of Amazon, can still dominate the market, because just think of the amount of e-commerce between Walmart and Amazon and all the other e-commerce firms out there. But flexibles are really coming on strong. And so it is a very big challenge because of the lack of recyclability. Here are our 4 iconic brands that used to be packaged in recyclable materials. Now they're not. Is this progress? I think that's what a key question for us today. You've got the good old Campbell soup can, Sun-Maid raisins, your baby food, and even Tide in detergent. Now PET is apparently passé in some uses. So I think this is really the dilemma before us today. And it isn't just the utility of this. Let's face it, these are great advertisements. They're in bright, bold colors. They stand up on the shelf. They're actually advertising. So it's the marketers who I think are in control a lot of this, and that's part of the challenge is with each corporation, how they make decisions about design. A lot of it has to do, obviously, with the shelf space and the shelf presentation and wanting to keep their market share with a really dazzling presentation. I'll skip that. I think we already know that. We've covered that earlier. These are kind of what I would call the four humongous or quadruple whammies facing us. And this is from the New Plastics Economy report. You may recognize that the production of plastics is going to increase 4 times by 2050. If we don't do anything, there'll be more plastics than fish in the ocean, which I think was a real jaw dropper for people last year when that report came out. The amount of oil being used for plastics consumption will go to 20%, and the amount of plastics as the total carbon budget will be up to 15%. So these are pretty sobering figures and why we have so much work to do. These, I think, these are the range of solutions. Many of them already been discussed here, so I won't linger on them. But clearly, we've got to fix the U.S. recycling system, and then we've obviously got to develop these basic systems in the 5 countries where much of the deposition is happening. Long term, we have to reduce plastic use, especially single use. It's not that we're not going to use plastic, as many people have said today. We have to be smarter about when it makes sense to use plastic, especially something that you're going to use for a few minutes, and then it could sit in a landfill for 100 years, and decoupling plastic from fossil fuels. So here, the recycling rates are still pretty poor for plastics. It's a little bit more there on the right-hand side. It's about 14%, but it's still quite small. And if you look, here's the EPA's chart about, obviously we're doing great on batteries. 98% of batteries are recycled. Cardboard, we're doing great. Steel. But the right 2 bars are the plastics. PET and the HDPE are still pretty low on this chart of selected materials from EPA. And the financing is key, and this is really one of the main points I want to make. We had discussions, which I want to talk about it in a couple minutes, about producer responsibility. We were a big part of that over the last 3 years with a number of big brands. And one of the things that came out of that was the development of the Closed Loop Fund and the reinvigoration of a group called the Recycling Partnership. And these are both great organizations, and I think they're key to the long-term solutions here in the U.S. But Ron Gonen, who started the Closed Loop Fund, told me that it would take about $1.5 billion investment to optimize our U.S. curbside system for the 21st century. And that's the goal. And you can see here what we've got currently for the $100 million in the Closed Loop Fund, and Recycling Partnership probably maybe $5 million or less. We've got a long way to go. We know where to go. We just don't have the resources. We don't know who's going to pay for it. So I think that's that's a key issue. And now we've also got rising NGO activity. I think many of you may know that last year there are now over 800 NGOs globally who are part of what's called Break Free from Plastic that are probably going to be developing campaigns this year, probably on some of the major consumer brands. You also have a number of cities in Asia that want to go the zero waste route. They don't want highly centralized waste systems. They want to work with collectives, and they don't want to burn waste. And it's very progressive. It's very challenging also. And again, I can skip over this. This is obviously some of the challenges working in Asia that we're going to have to face. But this is the big risk, obviously, is that pouches are going to become ads for lack of corporate responsibility. When the big brands see, or when you're on a beach in Asia and you see Procter & Gamble and Unilever products washing up on the beach, this suddenly becomes not so modern and not so cool, but a symbol of lack of corporate responsibility. And so I think that is really why the brands are going to have to step up more than they have. So we spent about 3 years between 2011 2013 with Nestle Waters North America trying to encourage other large brands to use producer responsibility to develop a policy of extended producer responsibility in the United States. Many of you may know that EPR is the law in Europe. It's mandated. It's in many of Canadian provinces. It's in over 40 of the large OECD countries, but not in the U.S. In the U.S., everything's paid for by us, the consumers or taxpayers. And long story short, we did not convince any of the big brands to embrace EPR, mainly because I think they felt they didn't have to at the time. And the beverage industry is used to this. They've been fighting battles for 20 years. Activists have been on their case, from Keep America Beautiful all the way up to the Pergs and Greenpeace. And they're much more sensitive to the problem, but once you get away from the beverage industries, from Coke and Pepsi, a lot of the big CPGs, Procter & Gamble and General Mills and so forth, aren't used to being asked about their packaging and whether they're responsible for it. So it's still a challenge, a work in progress. It didn't work out in the first run, but as I say, the development of the closed loop fund really put the issue on the radar of big companies, and so you had Walmart and many other, 7 or 8 other brands willing to put into a fund to build the infrastructure. One of the things, though, but let's look at some of the progress we have made, because we think the first step in this process is making packaging more recyclable. It just makes sense that if you can put more of your packaging into the curbside bin, it's less likely to end up being swept away. It's actually valued more. So we got Colgate, we talked to Colgate-Palmolive for a couple of years, and they saw the value in this and made a commitment to us to recycle everything in their 3 of their 4 product categories by 2020. The one that they're not so sure about is obviously the hard one, and that's the toothpaste tube, which is multi-material, laminate, and very difficult. They're going to work on it. They're not promising, but they think that in the other divisions, which is mostly cleaning products and personal care products, they'll be able to do that. So we're very happy that they were willing to come out and do that. Also, in 2014, we filed a shareholder proposal, which is basically what we do with companies at times to get their attention. And in response, Procter & Gamble made a very laudable commitment to make 90% of its packaging recyclable, or to put programs in place to create the ability to recycle them, also by 2020. So we know that these 2 companies have their engineers hard at work on some of these practical issues we've been talking about today to try to meet those deadlines. Interestingly, we got with an engagement with Honest Tea, which is a pouch that sits next to Capri Sun in a lot of store shelves. It's a kid's drink. And they actually agreed to switch part of their volume back to Aseptic because it's more recyclable. About 40% of the volume now of Honest Tea has been switched back. So there's and this is a brand owned by Coca-Cola now. So we felt it was interesting that at least one company decided to go back to switch to a more recyclable product. This year, we're working on the foam phase-out as a new proposal, and it's very interesting that the new Plastics Economy Report, there's been 2 of them that have come out from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. One of them, the second one came out this January, and it really wasn't heralded, but in the report was a recommendation to phase out the use of polystyrene, extended polystyrene and PVC. Basically just say get rid of it. As a society, we shouldn't have it. That's a pretty radical thing to say, actually, and so we're very happy that they made that recommendation. I think whether that actually happens will be a big challenge, but in recognition of this, partly we have encouraged McDonald's to phase out the use of foam cups. They've done it in the U.S., and we very much appreciate that, but it's still in use in some of these critical areas in Asia, notably in Hong Kong and in the Philippines, where it's more likely to end up in a waterway. And so we've asked them, we have a proposal that will be voted on in about 2 weeks, asking them to phase that out. We've also, the other piece of that was the packing material, and so we've engaged Amazon and Walmart and Target on that, and just a couple of weeks ago, Target actually agreed to begin to phase this out and to talk with their suppliers about phasing it out. So we're very happy about that. Target really got it, and we're talking to Amazon. We haven't quite made that progress yet, but we know Amazon is aware of this. They have a good frustration-free packaging program that's got a lot of positive things involved with it, but it isn't quite, there's not a lot of volume to it yet in terms of their total turnover. And then I wish I could take credit for this, but I really can't. Walmart on its own has done a lot of work that's great. They've also made a recyclable packaging commitment for all of theirs to be recycled for their private brands, and of course that's a lot with all their grocery brands by 2025. And as was mentioned earlier, they have a sustainable packaging playbook that now monitors all their suppliers and uses that as part of their index score, including the recycled content used. And they've made a really wonderful commitment that has gotten very little notice of increasing the amount of recycled resin in use, 3 billion pounds by 2020. I think I did a calculation once that might be about a 30% increase if they can do that in terms of what's used today. So this was, again, from the New Plastics Economy report showing that, if we can all get our act together to optimize systems, about 50% of materials could be recycled, about 20% could be redesigned for reuse applications, and then about 30% will need more fundamental redesign. And this is part of the problem, especially in the developing countries where, unlike in more developed countries where you might have a 20-ounce bottle of shampoo, you have single-use sachets by the millions, ostensibly because people can't afford the large size. And this is a lot of what's piling up on beaches and in roadways and waterways. And this is where I think some of the big CPGs have to deal with the redesign issues, is these non-recyclable sachets and pouches that just are becoming very commonplace. I wanted to end with a couple of comments. Starbucks, we've done a lot of work with, and I think Starbucks deserves a lot of credit. They have tried hard to work on end-of-life issues. They made a couple of big commitments about 10 or 12 years ago to recycle all of the cups, the paper coffee cups and plastic cups in their owned and operated stores by the end of 2015. Long story short, they made it about halfway there. They were at about 50%. They found that there weren't a lot of markets for a lot of the paper because of the plastic coating. There are a lot of mills that need to be tweaked. And perhaps the more ambitious commitment was a commitment to serve fully 1/4 of all coffee or all their beverages in reusables by the end of 2015. This sadly did not work out as well. I think they're at about 1.9%. This is with giving you a dime discount if you bring in your own thermal mug. But this is a much bigger challenge. But I think this is where we need to go as a culture. We need to be able to change the convenience mentality we were talking about earlier. And Starbucks has not given up. They're looking at kind of coming at this from different issues, and we're happy to talk to them and partner with them if possible on that. So to sum up, in terms of, I feel there's a big split between Europe and the U.S. that Europe has more tools because they have more mandates. They have the packaging directive has been around since 1994, I think, and there's a new goal proposed goal for 75% of packaging to be recycled by 2030. But the directive has resulted in a bunch of cooperation that was basically forced because of the mandate that we just don't have here in the U.S. And so they've learned how to be efficient in a lot of ways in terms of the collection and the various organizations that have been developed to implement it. And then you've got these ongoing circular economy and plastic strategies, which are only going to reinforce that, I think, with new mandates and the work of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Compare that with the U.S., where at best I think we're treading water. Because of how we're structured, there's no federal mandate to regulate recycling. It's all done at the state level, and of course then you've got 50 different strategies, and the states vary all over. And we did have this rejection of EPR with really no scalable alternative yet. And so we've got the municipal funding of programs is really what all the recycling is dependent on. And we have, I think that last point is really an important one, which is that in this day and age, can you allow disruptive packaging to be put on the market without consideration of the end impact if you're a major company? It's with the funding situation such as it is, it seems that the big manufacturers have to be much more involved in financing end markets if they're going to put disruptive materials on the market. So I'm going to, there we go. Just a couple more slides. And so here are some of the things that, in terms of our work over the last 10 years with companies, I think it's important they look beyond their own product impact. It's really hard for companies to look beyond just the products they're responsible for. It's just kind of not in their nature or their DNA, but the idea that you somehow have to look at all the materials that go into that curbside basket, not just the piece, if you're Coke, your bottle or your can, but you have to look at the paper that goes in there and the hundreds of different companies that generate material that go into that. And we really need a platform. We don't have a platform for it here in the United States for solving these issues. There really isn't one. And EPA is not really set up for that role. So I think we need to look at leaders, perhaps something coming out of these two groups, the Recycling Partnership or the Closed Loop Fund, can develop a platform where, pre-competitive platform where brands can be really committed to finding ways to solve this and to show at least partial responsibility, shared responsibility financially. I think we need transparency on funding and commitments to meet the goals, because companies make commitments, and then if you really don't monitor it, there will be backtracking. But also, I find that some commitments are made without really a total transparency about how they intend to get there, if they've really crunched the numbers. And so we're going to have, in the next 2 years, some discussions, because these two companies made commitments to As You Sow way back in 2008 and, 2009 and 10. And Pepsi said they would get to a 50% beverage industry recycling rate by 2018, and that's for their bottles and cans. And Nestle said they would get their PET rate up to 60. They're both going to be very, very hard to do. I think the beverage recycling rate is about 42%, but it's been very hard to move it more than 1% a year. The PET rate is down at 31, 34, depending upon which source you use. That's going to be very difficult. But I think just the fact that this is out there and the companies know there's pressure on them in the next 2 years is going to force some higher level of policy changes internally with these companies to work with their peers to get this done. So in conclusion, I think I've got three or four conclusions that I think are crucial here from the work that I've done. One is that obviously funding sources are a huge challenge, that voluntary has largely not worked, and yet mandates are unlikely because of our political situation. And so we're going to have to find some road in between that to encourage shared responsibility. Although in California and Connecticut we do have EPR bills laws, not pending, but possibly on the horizon. So a couple of states may be able to step up on that. I think the second thing is that we still need, most companies don't feel they have much responsibility post-consumer for packaging. The beverage industry is still the sector that feels the most pressure, and so a number of stakeholders need to educate more non-beverage companies that they have waste too, especially the fast food companies and many of the big grocery chains. And the third piece, I think, was taken from the new Plastics Economy report, which basically, again, made what I think is another radical proposal, which is that we really need to limit the resins on the market in the future.
I have another similar question along the same lines. Given the fact that Pepsi, for example, has connections throughout the country in terms of distribution, would it make sense for companies like Pepsi to take the lead on creating a regular or consistent recycling system throughout the United States in order to reach their goals and also to provide that service to their benefit, to the benefit of the people and to their company?
Well, see, to a large extent, we're dependent on the curbside system, although it's true that in certain states already in the Northeast, there are distributors of soda and water that do perform their own recycling functions, so it varies from state to state. I think the one thing that Pepsi has done that is notable that could somewhat relate to what you're saying is they've noted that about 30% of consumption is now on the go. So if you live at home and you recycle, fine, but a lot of people are eating lunch in a park or they're on a street, and a lot of that isn't captured. It's up to 30% of this, especially this fast food packaging. And so Pepsi has tried to put more recycling bins in their convenience stores and gas stations where a lot of people will dump this, but it hasn't been that successful. But I do credit them for realizing that about a third of the problem now is on the go. It's not the traditional, either it's your home or your office. We're in motion, and at the airports and all the transit places are all very different than the curbside system.
Thank you, Conrad.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.